Welcome back to Combat Mission Red Thunder for an experimental micro-unit guide where we're going to give the Soviet T70M Light Tank a quick going over. This was a development of the T60, designed between 1941 and 1942, using a lot of the same parts and really intending to combine the roles of light infantry support and reconnaissance vehicle. There are two variants modelled in CMRT, the 1942 and 1943 versions. These are pretty much identical for our purposes, to the point that the two variants share the same in-game model. The first thing to note about the T70 is that it is a very small tank. The 42 version weighs 9.2 tons, the 43 version weighs 9.9. That's less than the Panzer IIL Lynx at 13 tons, and even something like the Marder 3M, which sits at 10.5. Combining that with sloped armour, we have a very compact design. Tactically, that makes for a small target, but results in a very cramped interior, which, as we're going to see, creates a lot of problems. Starting at the front of the vehicle, we've got a front slope with a couple of important features. First, low down on the vehicle's starboard side, we have a hatch. Immediately behind this is the transmission. Beyond the transmission, we've got the T70M's two engines, one behind the other, with all the associated grills, pipes and exhausts down the starboard side of the tank all the way to the rear. In the 42 variant, these are truck engines, kicking out about 70 horsepower each. The 43 variant upgrades them to 85 horsepower engines. For reference, the engine of something like a T-34 is rated at 500 horsepower and doesn't bring all the added complications of there being two of them. Combine this with the narrow tracks, and the T-70M is not as mobile as you might expect for a light tank. Running it through the vehicle mobility test to get some arbitrary but comparative numbers, the 42 variant scored 798 points, and the 43 variant 724. For reference, an early T-34, the kind of vehicle the T-70 is supposed to be keeping pace with and providing reconnaissance for, sits at 679, and the Marder 3M, which is more of a similar weight, got 784. So it's definitely nothing special on the mobility front. That's a problem for a light tank, because it's made sacrifices in the design to maximise that mobility. The second feature of the front slope is the driver's hatch on the upper port side. This is similar to the driver's hatch on the T-34, opening up and forwards. With the hatch closed down, the driver has a single narrow periscope to see through, so he's not going to do a lot of spotting. The front slope itself offers protection up to 20mm AP fired at 500 meters. Anything larger, like German 50 and 75mm anti-tank guns, will poke holes without any problems, as will heat warheads from things like Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks. The side armour offers even less protection, it's only just immune to small arms fire. The 7.92mm AP ammunition found in German half-tracks will cause spalling and partial penetration. So not getting shot at in your T-70M is a good move. Moving up to the turret, this has been heavily influenced by the engine position. With the engines taking up the starboard side of the hull, the turret is not only offset to the port, but the turret ring is restricted in size. So it's a one-man turret inhabited by an overworked vehicle commander who not only has to order the driver around, scan for targets and try to communicate with other vehicles, but also has to load, aim and fire the T-70's weapons. Obviously, this is not an ideal arrangement, and it does a lot to degrade the tank's combat potential. On top of this, the commander has only two optics, the weapon sight and a single periscope mounted in his hatch, so like the driver, don't expect the TC to see very much if he's closed down. Opening up, the commander's hatch opens forwards and provides a little bit of cover, but he still has to expose himself to sea and has no protection to the sides or rear. Not only does this make him vulnerable, but he can't operate any of the turret weapons while he's opened up, and if he becomes a casualty, the T-70 is effectively neutralised. So although opening up can compensate for the T-70's terrible spotting, it also involves some significant and potentially fatal drawbacks. On the front of the turret we have the gun mantlet with, from left to right, a 45mm L46 1932 main gun, a 7.62 by 54R coaxial machine gun, and finally the gun sight for both of them. The 45mm gun is really starting to get outdated by the time we get to CMRT's summer 1944 start. At 500 meters, it's not going to get through the frontal armor of the Panzer IV, and although it can penetrate the front of lighter vehicles like half-tracks and armored cars, it's not necessarily going to do an awful lot of damage post-penetration. Notably, there are both APCR and AP rounds available, so you can also expect a drop-off in armour penetration once the armour-penetrating composite rigid rounds are used up. The 45 does better against side armour, obviously, and can tackle things like Panzer IVs and Stugs at closer ranges, but it's definitely limited in anti-tank terms. The T70M also carries high explosive shells for its main gun, but these are again pretty limited. The shells aren't big enough to fit a tremendous amount of explosives in them, so they need to be pretty accurate to get the job done against infantry in the open. To make up for this deficiency, the tank does carry some canister ammunition. Everybody loves canister. It's very effective against clumps of infantry, but characteristically short-ranged. Overall, the T70M carries 42 rounds of high explosive, 21 armor piercing, 4 armor piercing composite rigid, and 3 canister, which is a pretty good breakdown of what it's supposed to be engaging. Coaxially, we have a pretty standard 7.62 by 54 RMG. Not much to say here, it's a machine gun, it's good for dealing with infantry and forcing them to go into ground, so the T70 can finish them off with HE or canister, or probably more sensibly, run away. Interestingly, the T70 only carries 945 rounds of MG ammunition. That's not a lot, and the funny number seems to indicate a drum feed rather than a belt feed, which is another issue. The MG not only has limited ammunition, but in sustained fire it will need to be reloaded more often by that incredibly overworked tank commander. That's about it for the turret. There's not much else to say for a combat mission walkaround for the T70M. On the port side we have some equipment bins, the rear features the aforementioned engine grills and a spare road wheel. Noticeably absent for a vehicle with a reconnaissance role is a radio. None of the T70Ms have radios fitted, not even platoon or company command vehicles when taken as a formation. This creates some obvious C2 problems, meaning that TCs are mostly going to have to use visual signalling to communicate, either using hand or flag signals, and those aren't going to be an option if the TCs have to button up. So overall, the T70M is not great. In fact, it's pretty terrible. Thinking about the interplay between firepower, protection and mobility, the whole point of the T70 was that as a light tank, it would accept less firepower and a lower level of protection in exchange for increased mobility. But the design falls short on that mobility, as well as suffering from a number of visibility and ergonomic problems magnified by being restricted to a tiny two-man crew. So we have a vehicle that is lightly armed, poorly armoured, and not very mobile, whilst also being mostly blind, deaf and mute. The Soviets were aware of all these shortcomings. Production ended in 1943, and the intended roles for the T70 were taken over by the much more effective and more widely produced T-34 and Su-76. At the end of the day, it was a light tank, and whether light tanks are themselves a dead end of tank evolution is a bit of an open question. For all that though, it's always important to remember that combat power is relative. On a battlefield with a limited anti-tank threat, T-70s are still bringing a small arms-proof 45mm gun and a machine gun to the party. If the enemy can't effectively deal with it, even something as bad as a T-70 can be a decisive asset. So that's a quick once-over of the T-70. Hope you all enjoyed this one and found it interesting. It's an attempt at a simplified, faster unit guide format. We'll see if it makes a good complement to the more in-depth guides. I'll catch you in the next video.